The frozen edges of the European front were already collapsing into a landscape of ruin when word began to spread among scattered American platoons about a single gun team that refused to yield. It was not a story born from rumor or from the excited retellings of exhausted infantrymen seeking comfort around shell-scorched barns. It was whispered because no one could believe it. Along a battered stretch of woodland where the lines had grown thin and German patrols moved with renewed confidence, a lone machine gun position had sustained an impossible rhythm of fire. Men who had crawled back from the tree line with torn uniforms and shaking hands described the sound as something unnatural, a pulse of steel, steady, unbroken, and too deliberate to be accidental. In a war where so much depended on timing, weather, supply, and sheer luck, the idea that one modified M1919 machine gun had stopped wave after wave of German infantry did not seem believable. Yet the survivors insisted the impossible had unfolded before their eyes. What began as a routine holding action had transformed into a desperate stand, where every second stretched long enough for men to question whether they would see dawn, and every breath felt borrowed from the gray of approaching winter. The forest canopy dripped with thawing frost as thin morning light filtered through the haze of dun smoke. Snowbanks were shattered by mortar bursts, branches lay splintered and stripped, and the earth had been churned into a ragged patchwork of frozen clods and cratered mud. In this harsh terrain, too uneven for armor, too exposed for retreat, and too isolated for reinforcements, small groups often bore the weight of holding entire sectors. It was here, in this corridor of ice and broken trees, that the legend began to take shape. No grand speeches, no heroic declarations, nothing that resembled the dramatized retellings that would later appear in mess halls. Just a quiet, steady act of defiance carried out under a pressure that crushed most men long before their ammunition ran dry. Before the situation spiraled into chaos, the position had been an ordinary emplacement tucked between two fallen pines. Sandbags, rough logs, and canvas sheets stiffened by frost made up the barriers. The machine gun rested on a tripod whose legs had been driven deep into the earth to keep recoil from shifting the line of fire. The crew had reinforced the mounting plate with scavenged metal fragments, hammered flat and bolted in place. Even the feed system had been altered with field-expedient adjustments to keep the weapon from choking in the cold. Their sector had been considered quiet until reconnaissance reported unusual German movement across the far ridge. What followed was a test that few believed any lightly manned machine gun nest could endure. Under the crushing weight of advancing infantry, artillery spotting rounds, and creeping smoke screens, the forest became a battleground where visibility shrank to mere meters, and every footstep on frozen soil carried the threat of enemy contact. Yet through this storm of pressure, the gun did not fall silent. The operator maintained his discipline, adjusting his aim by inches, scanning the advancing shapes with a methodical calm that unnerved even those fighting beside him. In the stillness between bursts, the men felt the gravity of what was coming. Each echo rolling through the trees became both a warning and a promise that as long as the gun still hammered its rhythm, there remained a sliver of resistance carved into the land. And as dusk approached, painting the snow with the last muted colors of fading daylight, the crew understood something unspoken. This stand, however long it lasted, would test the limits of human endurance as much as the strength of steel. When the first German assault group advanced through the tangled undergrowth, they expected a fleeting exchange of fire, followed by a swift overrun of the American position. The forest floor was littered with thick roots, frozen branches, and abandoned supply crates from earlier withdrawals, all of which slowed progress and forced soldiers into narrow channels between trees. Yet these natural funnels played directly into the hands of the gun crew. As the enemy closed in, the modified M1919 opened with a controlled burst, cutting across the ridgeline with an unwavering stream of fire. The snow erupted into a mist of fractured ice as rounds struck the frozen ground, shredding the silence and announcing to the attackers that the path forward would not be taken easily. German riflemen dropped behind shattered trunks, returning fire with disciplined volleys, while squad leaders shouted orders muffled by winter scarves and the crack of gunfire. But their first assumption that this was a standard American defensive line quickly eroded. Instead of the sporadic, hesitant fire expected from a small unit, they were met with relentless and perfectly timed bursts. The machine gun never wandered too far off its lane, never hesitated, never wasted ammunition in blind panic. The sound carried a steadiness that should not have been possible under such extreme pressure. The gunner shifted his aim with small, precise movements, guiding the line of fire across advancing shapes as though he could sense their positions even through drifting smoke and the dim shadows beneath the pines. Each controlled burst forced the Germans to regroup farther back, disrupting their rhythm long enough to stall momentum. The forest canopy above shimmered with powder shaken loose by concussive shockwaves, drifting through the haze like pale ash. Hidden mortar teams attempted to break the position by zeroing in on the muzzle flash, but the crew had anticipated this and covered the barrel with heat-dispersing cloth and snow-packed insulation to blur its signature. Even when the enemy adjusted trajectories, the shells exploded slightly off-target, hurtling debris but failing to silence the nest. Under normal circumstances, a machine gun's barrel would overheat and threaten the crew long before a second wave arrived. Yet the modifications held firm. The reinforced mounting plate absorbed shock that would have dislodged lesser setups. The cooling adjustments extended firing time without forcing a full shutdown. And the feed system, usually prone to freezing or jamming in low temperatures, continued to cycle with an almost improbable smoothness. The crew behind the gun worked in near silence, speaking only when essential. The man responsible for changing belts moved with an efficiency born from repetition. His gloved hands seemed unaffected by the cold as he fed round after round into place. Another kept watch over their flanks, scanning for German patrols attempting to maneuver behind them. Despite growing exhaustion, their coordination did not falter. Hours passed, and the winter light dimmed until the forest dissolved into a monotone veil of gray. The enemy adjusted their tactics, probing from multiple angles in an effort to locate a blind spot or weak point in the defense. But each attempt was met with the same controlled fire that stitched through branches and cut down figures pushing too close. The sound echoed through the trees like a metronome of survival, each burst marking time in a battle where seconds could decide whether the line cracked or held. By the time the first night set in, the Germans realized they were not simply facing a determined defender. They were facing a position engineered to defy collapse. And in that realization, the first seeds of doubt began to spread through their ranks.
By the time the second night threatened to swallow the forest in near total darkness, the German command believed the American line had to be close to breaking. No small outpost could maintain such a tempo without exhaustion hollowing out discipline or cold tightening its grip until hands grew too numb to manage even the simplest clearing drill. Yet the gun did not slow. Instead, it carved a new rhythm into the night, each burst stripping branches, tearing through snowbanks, and scattering sparks where rounds struck frozen stone. The narrow trails, once quiet passages between skeletal trees, had transformed into corridors littered with discarded gear and the faint silhouettes of craters steaming in the cold. Snowdrifts, once pure white, had darkened under the weight of battle, and every gust of wind carried the bitter smell of cordite mixed with the earthy dampness of uprooted soil. The crew knew the enemy was regrouping in the shadows beyond visibility. They felt it in the unnatural stillness between probing attacks, in the faint scraping of movement carried by shifting winds, and in the low, distant rumble of boots trampling frozen ground. But they also understood that silence did not bring relief. It brought anticipation, an ache that settled into the chest as surely as the cold settled into the bones. The gunner's world had shrunk to a narrow band of forest ahead, illuminated only by occasional muzzle flashes reflected off drifting smoke. His gloves were stiff with frost, yet his movements remained steady because hesitation meant collapse. To his left, the assistant gunner kept the belts flowing across the feed tray, tapping them into alignment with the familiarity of someone who had repeated the motion thousands of times. Their breath rose in clouds, forming fleeting ghosts that dissipated long before they reached the low branches overhead. Beyond the shattered tree line, the Germans prepared their next advance with a grim determination forged by orders as much as necessity. Some carried flamethrowers, hoping to burn the nest out of existence. Others dragged MG-34 teams into position to drown the Americans in counterfire. And behind them, riflemen tightened their grips around cold steel, waiting for the moment when a coordinated surge might finally overwhelm the defenders. The Americans heard the first signs of this buildup in the distant clatter of equipment being repositioned and in the faint sound of bark being scraped as weapons were braced against trees. They reacted without words, tightening their formation, repositioning ammunition boxes, and checking that each belt remained free of ice. The tension thickened as the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a suddenness that shook frost from the branches, the Germans surged forward in a staggered wave. Flame projectors hissed through the dark, sending rolling arcs of fire that cast grotesque shadows across the snow. German machine guns answered with long, punishing bursts. Yet before the assault could fully take shape, the M1919 roared to life. Its fire cut through the advancing line and forced men to drop behind what little cover the forest provided. The flames illuminated their silhouettes long enough for the gunner to track and correct his aim with calm precision. For every yard they gained, they were pushed back 2 more. The crew's endurance teetered on the edge of human limits, but their coordination did not break. Inch by inch, burst by burst, they clawed back control of a fight that should have overwhelmed them. Above them, a canopy once thick with frost now trembled with the concussion of repeated firing. Snow drifted down in uneven curtains, mixing with smoke until the ground became a swirl of white, gray, and embers. And even as exhaustion began to blur the edges of vision, the gunner knew he could not surrender a single heartbeat of focus. For in the hollow between bursts, he sensed a truth that every soldier eventually learned. Once the line faltered, no amount of courage could stitch it back together again.
As dawn crawled over the 3rd day, the forest revealed the scars of the unrelenting struggle. Trees that once stood tall now leaned at unnatural angles, their trunks splintered by shrapnel or charred by fire. Snow had melted into slush where repeated bursts had heated the ground, only to freeze again overnight into jagged plates of ice. The air retained a metallic sting, heavy with the residue of countless detonations. Into this bleak landscape, the Germans prepared their most coordinated attack yet, determined to break through before fatigue wore down their strength. Mortar teams, heavy rifle squads, and grenadiers were brought forward to clear entrenched positions. American patrols, stretched thin, understood that if the gun crew faltered, nothing stood between the enemy and deeper penetration across the flank. The gunner's hands trembled not from fear, but from cold and the strain of hours gripping the weapon. His vision blurred at the edges from smoke irritation and lack of sleep, yet he forced his breathing into a steady cadence. Each breath was a slow drag through icy air, searing his lungs before dissipating into the haze. American patrols, stretched thin, understood that if the gun crew faltered, nothing stood between the enemy and deeper penetration across the flank. The assistant gunner nursed frost-bitten fingertips, yet refused to stop feeding belts, pushing through the pain with mechanical determination. Their communication remained minimal, a series of taps, gestures, and silent acknowledgments, built from trust formed long before this fight. When German mortars began to fall, the first impacts shook loose powder from the canopy, forming a white veil that reduced visibility. Shells carved deep craters into the ground, kicking up fragments of bark and soil. Americans hunched low, shielding the gun as best they could, while the forest erupted around them. As the barrage eased, German riflemen pushed forward under smoke grenades, swift and coordinated along pre-selected lanes. The gunner recognized the tactic immediately. These were assault detachments trained for breaching fortified positions. He shifted the gun slightly, directing fire across the lead elements. The weapon barked with renewed ferocity, scattering the first wave before it could spread out. Yet as each group fell back, another surged forward to take its place. The fighting intensified into a brutal contest of endurance. The crew responded with relentless precision, conserving ammunition where needed, and delivering decisive bursts when enemy figures broke from concealment. They worked as one, bound not by orders, but by the unspoken understanding no reinforcement was coming. Their only measure of success, the line had not yet collapsed. Hours dragged on, turning the ground into a labyrinth of churned snow, ammunition links, fractured wood, and spent casings. Steam rose from the barrel despite the cold, drifting upward before blending with smoke clouds. Somewhere in the forest, German officers shouted commands, muffled by distance and wind. But the gun did not relent. Its steady cadence echoed through the trees like a heartbeat, one that refused to go silent despite overwhelming pressure. Germans pushed through exhaustion, driven by orders and necessity, advancing inch by inch. Yet each time their formation stabilized, the M1919 tore into them with brutal precision. Shadows lengthened across the snow, and the attackers realized they were losing time. The forest remained in American hands, held not by numbers or firepower, but by a machine gun nest defying the odds with each passing hour.
By late afternoon, the sun hung low on the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the battlefield. The temperature dropped again, turning exposed water into thin, glass-like sheets and tightening the cold around every piece of metal. The gunner wiped frost from the sights with a stiff glove, though his fingers could barely feel the texture of the cloth. His face was smeared with soot and the residue of propellant, dark streaks across skin chapped by relentless wind. Every muscle in his body protested each movement, yet he forced himself to remain still, knowing the next wave could break through at any moment. The quiet between engagements was deceptive. Beneath it lay a tension so dense it felt like an additional weight pressing down on fatigued shoulders. Americans listened to faint clicks of weapons being prepared, subdued murmurs of German officers arranging their approach, and the crunching of snow as new units rotated forward. Supplies were dwindling. Ammunition boxes lay empty in small heaps, their contents long fed into the insatiable weapon. What remained was enough for one final stand, not a prolonged fight. The crew rationed each belt with precision born from necessity, memorizing every round as though the battle depended on it. When the Germans emerged again, they did so in near silence, their figures shapeless in the dim twilight. They advanced with deliberateness absent from earlier assaults, each man aware this push had to succeed where others failed. American riflemen returned controlled fire, giving the gun crew just enough time to prepare. The M1919 opened with measured bursts, its muzzle flashing in the mist as rounds stitched across lead elements. Germans ducked behind fallen logs, returning fire with desperate intensity. Some attempted to flank the position, but the assistant gunner redirected primary fire to intercept them, buying precious seconds for the line to reposition. The gunner's vision tunneled as adrenaline surged through fatigue. He saw only shapes,
movement, and subtle shifts in shadow signaling danger. Each burst illuminated the forest in a stark strobe, revealing German helmets bobbing between trees and faint plumes of breath rising from hidden attackers. The battle surged between moments of explosive violence and eerie stillness. Time warped into a blur where minutes stretched into painful eternities. The gunner's arms burned from recoil, but his hands remained locked on the grips. His assistant moved with rigid determination, feeding belt after belt until the last case was reached. The realization struck them both at once. The end of the fight would come soon, one way or another. As the Germans launched their final coordinated charge, the M1919 unleashed its last reserves of strength. Bursts rang through the forest with a force that pushed back the assault, cutting through the line and halting momentum. German soldiers faltered, hesitated, and pulled back, unable to breach the relentless defense. The gunner exhaled slowly, his breath fading into the bitter air as he released the trigger. Around him, the forest settled into a heavy silence, broken only by distant retreating footsteps. Snow drifted down in soft flakes, settling across the torn earth like a thin shroud. The crew held their ground, battered, exhausted, but unbroken. And in that silence, they understood the magnitude of what they had done, not in glory, not in triumph, but in the somber recognition that their stand had shaped the fate of the forest, if only for a moment longer.
The forest did not return to peace after the last assault faded. Instead, it settled into a hushed unease, the kind that clings to a battlefield long after violence has passed. Branches cracked under the weight of frost, distant detonations echoed like muted thunder, and the quiet rasp of wind carried the bitter smell of spent propellant. The American gun crew, stiff with exhaustion, remained hunched behind their makeshift barricade of logs and snow-packed sandbags. Faces etched with the strain of sleepless hours, the line between collapse and endurance had blurred. Stopping no longer felt like an option. Every muscle vibrated with fatigue, yet senses remained sharpened by instinctive alertness. The assistant gunner slumped briefly against the frozen earth, only to jolt upright when a branch snapped beyond the tree line. Even small sounds felt amplified in the cold, the metallic clatter of rifle bolts, the crunch of boots on icy soil, or whispered commands of enemy squads regrouping in fading daylight. Across the sector, American units attempted to stabilize positions. Runners moved between foxholes with sealed notes, breath rising in pale bursts as they sprinted through narrow snow-carved trenches. Squad leaders checked ammunition, repositioned riflemen, and mapped likely German approach lanes in fading daylight. Every soldier knew the same truth. The machine gun nest was the keystone of the defensive line. If it fell, the flanks would unravel, and the forest would open to the enemy. Yet despite this weight, the gun crew received no relief. Too many units pinned elsewhere, too many supply lines disrupted by artillery, too many men struggling simply to hold their ground. As dusk settled, a creeping fog rolled through the trees, swallowing the forest in a damp, colorless haze. Shapes blurred into shadows, visibility shrank to mere meters. The fog became both shield and threat. The gunner tightened his grip, scanning the fog-laced darkness for shifting silhouettes. His body trembled from cold and exertion, but his mind remained tethered to the rhythm of firing, reloading, scanning, adjusting. He functioned on raw determination, long past adrenaline. Time had shrunk to the space between each burst of fire, each movement of the feed belt, each breath fogging in front of him. Faint echoes emerged from the trees, soft, deliberate movements indicating German soldiers probing the line. A branch snapped, a stone shifted, snow crunched under weight. The gunner suppressed the urge to fire blindly. When a faint silhouette broke the fog, he squeezed the trigger, delivering a controlled burst that carved through the trees and sent the figure scrambling back into the mist. More movement followed, the enemy repositioned, perhaps preparing to slip closer under cover of darkness.
Americans answered with timing sharpened by the relentlessness of previous days. Riflemen along the flanks fired into likely approach paths, their shots sharp and fleeting in the muffled forest. The M1919 joined only when necessary, conserving the precious little ammunition left. The cold deepened, weaving through their gear, clothing, and bones, yet the position held, maintained by men refusing to yield, even as exhaustion thickened their limbs, stole clarity, and blurred vision. The fog eventually thinned, revealing a dim night sky stripped of stars, swallowed by smoke and drifting clouds. In the dimness, the gun crew waited for whatever came next. They had survived the storm of assaults, but the battle had not ended. The fight had only changed shape, shifting into a quieter, more insidious struggle where endurance, patience, and resolve mattered as much as weaponry. Through it all, the gun remained ready, its barrel darkened by constant firing, its tripod half buried in churned earth, its operators clinging to fading strength with determination forged in the harsh crucible of the forest.
Night in the forest brought a new kind of danger. Without moonlight, the trees stood as black monoliths, their branches twisting into a canopy that swallowed what little ambient glow filtered through the clouds. Shadows thickened, almost physical, dense enough to obscure movement and distort shapes. For the gun crew, this darkness was a double-edged blade. It concealed them from distant enemy positions, but it also hid German patrols attempting to infiltrate the line. The cold deepened, each exhale crystallizing instantly, forming shimmering trails that hung before dissolving into darkness. Frost accumulated on the gun, forming thin, jagged patterns across its receiver and barrel shroud. The crew fought against the chill, wrapping cloth around exposed sections, brushing away ice despite aching fingers. Fatigue settled heavily over them, slowing movements, clouding thoughts, yet the need to stay alert overpowered all else. Each man forced himself semi-upright, ears tuned to the faintest disturbances in the night. Somewhere in the trees, a rifle bolt slid into place, a soft metallic click, nearly swallowed by wind but unmistakable to the Americans. The gunner pivoted the weapon slightly, angling toward the probable source without firing. He waited. He listened. Silence answered, broken only by faint rustling of branches. Then came soft, rhythmic footsteps advancing in tandem. Enemy patrols moved in small, staggered groups, hoping to bypass the line through narrow gaps. This measured infiltration could unravel the defense if unchecked, but the Americans remained vigilant. A flare arced into the sky from a distant unit, illuminating the forest in an eerie glow. Shapes shifted behind trees, helmets glinting before diving back into darkness. Riflemen along the flank fired, the shots sharp and fleeting across the frozen terrain. The gunner answered with a short, disciplined burst, muzzle flash momentarily casting stark shadows and revealing snow swirling chaotically. The burst struck close enough to halt the patrol, forcing Germans to withdraw into safer positions. Yet the threat remained, probing for weaknesses. Hours passed in a torturous cycle of tension and response. Americans fired only when necessary, conserving ammunition and avoiding revealing exact positions. Germans responded with occasional bursts from light machine guns or soft thumps of distant mortar rounds, probing rather than breaking through. The gun crew fought to keep eyes open, the gunner wavering between consciousness and near sleep. Blinks felt too long, too heavy. The assistant shook himself awake repeatedly, slapping cheeks with gloved hands to maintain focus. Despite crushing fatigue, instincts anchored them in place. Near dawn, the forest shifted again. The wind carried a new sound, not scattered patrols, but the steady buildup of infantry assembling for a larger push. German commanders, frustrated by failed infiltrations, decided on another full assault under cover of early morning gray. Subtle vibrations in the earth revealed movement of larger groups. Distant voices carried renewed urgency. The battle was about to reignite with ferocity equal to or greater than before. Though nearly spent, the gun crew steadied themselves. Dawn approached, and with it, the next test of their resolve.
The first pale streaks of morning filtered unevenly through the battered canopy, revealing a forest scarred by days of relentless fighting. Snow had hardened into a rough, uneven crust, the ground bearing pockmarks of mortar fire and jagged wounds from shattered trees. The cold air carried a quiet heaviness, as though the forest itself braced for what was coming. The Americans sensed the shift before the first shot rang out. In the sudden stillness of the wind, the faint tremor of distant movement, and the muted murmurs of German soldiers gathering in the fog-veiled distance. The gun crew prepared with grim familiarity, rechecking ammunition belts, repositioning makeshift cover, ensuring the barrel remained free of ice. Supplies had dwindled dangerously low, leaving only enough ammunition to withstand a final decisive assault. The gunner settled behind the weapon, movements automatic and painfully deliberate. Every muscle protested, fingers curled stiffly around the grips, forced into steadiness. The assistant counted remaining belts, memorizing their weight and length, as if committing the stand itself to memory. Across the line, American riflemen steeled themselves, adjusting sights, checking their last magazines. Then the silence shattered. German assault squads charged through the fog, figures emerging like ghosts from the pale morning haze. Muzzles flashed in the gray, bursts fracturing the quiet as bullets tore into tree trunks and shattered branches. Mortar shells landed with thunderous force, sending plumes of snow and earth skyward. Americans braced against the concussions, minds snapping into clarity as adrenaline pushed aside exhaustion. The M1919 roared to life. Its bursts cut across the advancing line with impossible precision. Fog glowed with each muzzle flash, revealing silhouettes dropping behind fallen logs, ducking between trees, collapsing under relentless fire. The forest trembled under repeated concussions, branches shedding clumps of snow like ash. German machine guns stitched across the Americans' positions, splinters erupting from wooden barriers. Yet the gun crew remained steady. The assistant fed belts with unwavering focus, pushing past burning hands. The gunner tracked flanking movements with micro-adjustments, each burst measured, each correction deliberate. They no longer fought for survival, they fought because the line depended on them. Smoke grenades rolled across the snow, merging with morning fog until visibility dwindled to near nothing. Shadows flickered through the haze, drawing fire from both sides. The gunner fired into movement, not form, relying on instinct and the faint sound of shifting snow to guide aim. Each time the Germans neared, the M1919 answered, forcing them back. The weapon became the rhythm of resistance, the anchor that held the forest. The battle raged for hours, though time had lost all meaning. Fog thinned occasionally, revealing the fighting's full extent. Bodies half buried in churned snow, gear scattered, the forest floor a mosaic of footprints, shell fragments, and scorched patches. Germans pressed forward stubbornly, but fatigue and casualties eroded momentum. Their final push faltered under the M1919's relentless fire, formations unraveling into scattered remnants. When the assault broke, it was not dramatic, but the slow, reluctant withdrawal of men who could no longer continue. The forest quieted. The guns slackened. Americans exhaled in fragile relief. They had held again, the cost etched deep into their bones. The aftermath of the assault settled over the forest with a heaviness that felt almost unnatural. Fog lingered in patches across the tree line, drifting lazily as if the air itself had grown weary. Snowflakes began to fall, light, sparse, almost delicate, yet they contrasted eerily with the violence that had ripped through the landscape moments before. The gun crew remained where they were, shoulders slumped, heads bowed, the weight of survival pressing heavily on their battered frames. Breaths formed trembling clouds as they struggled to steady nerves. The gunner released his grip, flexing fingers, a sharp pain rippled through joints stiffened by cold and overuse. He looked over the receiver, blackened by soot, streaked with frost, the barrel emitting faint heat, the last remnants of brutal firing. The assistant gunner leaned back against the snow-packed fourth barrier, chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. Hands numb, fingertips burning, he continued with reflex, checking belts, clearing links, stacking spent casings, as if tidying the remnants of battle could restore clarity. The forest around them felt hollow. Occasional pops echoed in the distance, distant skirmishes or collapsing branches weakened by explosions. Immediate gunfire had ceased. Germans had pulled back beyond the ridge, their movements faint and scattered. American riflemen shifted in foxholes, exchanging brief glances and minimal words. They understood. The enemy had withdrawn not by choice, but because they had no other option. The defense had held. Supplies remained dire. Only a few belts of ammunition lay untouched, insufficient to survive another coordinated assault. Even so, in the eerie calm of the aftermath, the Americans found a sliver of reprieve. The gunner gazed across the scarred tree line. Smoke curled from shattered trunks, drifting upward in thin ribbons catching the faint morning light. Patches of earth churned into dark, muddy craters. Equipment lay strewn across the snow, helmets, torn packs, fragments of weapons. The forest looked less like a battlefield and more like a monument to unyielding resistance. Despite exhaustion, the crew remained alert. They had learned quiet often preceded violence, and assumptions could cost lives. The gunner forced his aching body back behind the weapon. The assistant resumed his station beside him, movements slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial in their precision. As midday approached, faint voices carried through the trees, American voices. A small patrol emerged from the fog, uniforms dusted with snow, expressions a mix of shock and admiration. They had expected collapse or chaotic retreat. Instead, they found two men still manning a gun seemingly welded into the earth by sheer will. Reports went out quickly. Word spread through nearby commands of what the gun crew had endured. Runners arrived with small bundles of ammunition, far from enough, but sufficient for another brief engagement. Alongside came warm canteens pressed into cold hands and a few whispered words of encouragement. Even with reinforcements, the line remained fragile. Germans were not defeated, they had merely been forced to adapt. Their next move could come at any moment. Americans braced accordingly. As dusk neared, casting long shadows across the ravaged terrain, the gun crew remained at their post. The M1919 stood ready, battered, frost-coated, blackened by relentless fighting, yet still functional. The men behind it were in the same state, worn to the edge of collapse, but unwilling to yield. For they understood the battlefield's unforgiving truth. Holding the line required not just firepower, but resolve deep enough to withstand whatever the night threatened to bring.
The approach of another night brought with it the suffocating uncertainty that had become as constant as the cold. The sky dimmed gradually, turning from muted gray into featureless darkness that swallowed the contours of the trees. The forest grew eerily silent, its earlier chaos replaced by a tense stillness that seeped into every corner of the battlefield. The gun crew felt the weariness of 3 days settle into their bones, roots of exhaustion twisting through every muscle until even the smallest movement felt monumental. Yet neither man allowed posture to slacken. They had endured too much, seen too much to relax vigilance now. The thin line of American defenders adjusted positions as night deepened. Rifle barrels glinted faintly as men checked sights and cleared chambers, preparing for another round of fighting should the enemy re-emerge. In the shadows, medics tended to the wounded with quiet resolve, binding frost-bitten extremities and applying makeshift splints fashioned from broken branches. The gunner inhaled slowly, cold air sharpening his senses, gloves stiff with frozen sweat, fingers gripping the weapon, ready to fire at the first sign of movement. The assistant gunner developed a rhythmic pattern, checking belts, adjusting mounting, scanning peripheral flanks. Though his eyes burned with fatigue, he caught subtle shifts in darkness that could mean the difference between survival and disaster. The Germans remained unseen. Silence was rarely a gift. It often meant regrouping, repositioning,
rethinking strategy. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Each time one nodded forward, a jolt of cold or distant movement snapped them back into focus. They spoke little, conserving strength, yet their unspoken coordination held firm, operating solely on instinct, discipline, and a resolve carved by necessity. Eventually, faint movement emerged from the darkness, subtle at first, a soft crunch, a shift of shadow. The gunner steadied his breathing, narrowing gaze to discern faint outlines. The Germans were crawling, attempting to approach the line in silence. The gunner waited, resisting the urge to fire too early. Premature fire could alert hidden units waiting beyond. Finally, when one figure rose slightly to signal others, the M1919 erupted into the night with suddenness that broke the forest's suspended calm. Its muzzle flash illuminated the immediate area, revealing silhouettes caught mid-motion. The burst tore into the creeping line, scattering men, forcing them to scramble backward. Panicked shouts echoed through the trees, followed by hurried rifle fire aimed blindly towards the gun's flash. The Americans responded with disciplined volleys, shots weaving through darkness with deadly precision. The Germans, realizing infiltration had been detected, attempted to salvage the attack with rushing movements, but the gun tore through their advance once again. The assistant gunner fed the belt with trembling hands, frantic but controlled movements. The fight surged for several minutes, darkness flickering intermittently with bursts of light. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the enemy melted back into the forest, retreating into silence once more. The gun crew slumped back against their barrier, each trembling from adrenaline and fatigue. They had survived another test, perhaps the last major one of this relentless siege. Survival did not bring celebration. It brought a heavy, somber realization. The line remained intact not through strength alone, but through a fragile balance of endurance and dwindling resources. The gun stood silently in the darkness, barrel cooling in the frigid air, operators holding on to the last threads of their strength. The battle was not yet over, but dawn, somewhere beyond exhaustion, waited to break the horizon once more.
The gray dawn crept over the forest like a cautious intruder, spilling cold light over churned snow, shattered trees, and the eerie remnants of past assaults. Every surface glittered with frost, each branch heavy with ice, and the faint aroma of spent gunpowder hung in the air. The M1919 remained fixed in its frozen tripod, a sentinel of survival, its operators shadowed figures etched against the snow. Morning did not bring relief, only clarity. The next German attack would be larger, more coordinated, and more determined. McKinley's squad understood that a single lapse could collapse the line. Private Ree, bandaged from the previous day's close calls, huddled beside a frozen log, adjusting the strap of his rifle with trembling fingers. Around him, men moved with quiet efficiency, repositioning supplies, checking the integrity of foxholes, and scanning tree lines for subtle hints of enemy approach. Each movement carried the weight of past losses, a tension that twisted muscle and bone. The forest was still scarred, branches split in jagged angles, snow churned into uneven craters from shell impacts, and bodies lay hidden under freshly fallen snow, reminders of sacrifices paid in the previous engagements. McKinley emerged from behind his barricade, cold biting through layers of cloth, eyes scanning the horizon. He carried the modified M1919 with a sense of both reverence and utility. His squad looked to him, eyes reflecting exhaustion, fear, and hope in equal measure. McKinley did not speak. Words were useless. The battlefield communicated in fire and silence. The first hints of German movement came from the distant ridge. A line of shadowed figures, small at first, slowly grew larger as fog clung to low terrain. The Germans were advancing deliberately, perhaps expecting to meet weakened resistance. McKinley counted silently, noting formations, distances, and intervals.
His mind calculated trajectories, rates of fire, and reload timing. The forest seemed to hold its breath, listening. Then the crack of rifles erupted, distant at first, then growing in intensity. The Germans had begun the attack. McKinley steadied himself, thumb brushing against the trigger, eyes narrowing to the first approaching target. The M1919 roared, each burst precise and deliberate, cutting down the lead waves. Snowflakes stirred in the muzzle flash, drifting like frozen sparks. Riflemen on the flanks fired in harmony, their shots weaving an invisible net that broke the momentum of the advance. The Germans faltered, and McKinley's squad exploited every hesitation. The fog blurred the distance, disguising the exact count of enemy dead, but the result was clear. The forest remained unbroken. Despite exhaustion and frozen limbs, the squad moved in practiced rhythm. Belts were replaced, rounds counted, positions adjusted. The fight continued for hours, a brutal interplay of firepower, anticipation, and instinct. The forest itself seemed alive with tension, each creak of a branch or crunch of snow magnified in the still air. McKinley's eyes never left the advancing line. His mind replayed statistics, past failures, and the inevitability of human error. The M1919, modified and unforgiving, was an extension of that mind. Each burst of fire was a calculated answer to the enemy's movement. By the time the Germans fell back once more, the Americans had exacted a heavy toll. Dozens of enemy soldiers eliminated, their formations disrupted, and momentum shattered. Yet McKinley knew this was only the beginning. Survival demanded vigilance, and the forest offered no guarantees.
Hours blurred into an endless rhythm of tension and calculation. The forest, once silent after the first assault, now hummed with the presence of scouts, patrols, and intermittent artillery fire. Snow, trampled and churned, reflected fleeting sunlight, revealing impressions of boots, rifles, and dragging bodies. McKinley's squad moved with disciplined urgency, constantly adjusting defensive lines, replenishing ammunition, and exchanging terse instructions. His modified M1919 was now as much a symbol of their survival as a tool, the external magazine a lifeline in a forest that offered no mercy. From the ridge, the Germans launched another probing maneuver. Smoke grenades rolled across frozen ground, veiling their approach, their muffled shouts distorted by the fog. McKinley anticipated the pattern, timing his bursts to intercept movement that should have signaled vulnerability. He unleashed precise, controlled fire that shattered the advancing shadows. The forest erupted with chaos. Fallen branches, displaced snow, and scattered bodies marked each decision point, each burst of fire. Riflemen along the flanks synchronized shots, their muzzle flashes painting stark contrasts against the pale morning snow. The Germans attempted flanking maneuvers, using smoke to mask movement, yet the unpredictability of McKinley's firing rhythm undermined their coordination. What had been predictable, a standard 8-round pause, was now entirely disjointed. The Germans counted, hesitated, and were met with additional rounds from the external magazine. Every miscalculation cost lives. McKinley, despite frozen fingers and aching limbs, adapted instantly. He rotated the weapon, repositioned the tripod, and timed bursts to exploit every lapse in enemy spacing. The forest seemed to contract around them, the line between observer and participant erased by necessity. Private Ree, following McKinley's cues, learned instinctively when to fire, when to reload, and when to hold. Each man became a node in a calculated network of resistance. Hours passed, each engagement repeating a similar pattern: approach, misjudged pause, devastating fire. The Germans were learning, but too late. Each wave faltered under the unexpected continuity of American semi-automatic fire. By early afternoon, McKinley had expended hundreds of rounds, alternating between the standard and external magazines with a precision born from weeks of experimentation and observation. The impact was immediate. Casualty rates for the enemy skyrocketed, their morale faltering as the forest swallowed retreating figures into fog and snow. Observers from nearby American positions recorded the effects. Waves that should have penetrated defensive lines collapsed, advancing soldiers hesitant, confused, and increasingly wary. The tactical advantage of McKinley's modification was undeniable, providing sustained fire where doctrine predicted vulnerability. Amid this calculated carnage, McKinley remained unemotional, mechanical, focused, and disciplined. He understood the forest as both battlefield and instrument, each tree, mound, and drift a factor in his calculations. By late afternoon, the Germans had withdrawn, leaving the American line intact. Casualties on the American side were minimal compared to previous engagements. The squad had endured with losses far below the expected toll, yet the weight of continuous action had etched deep lines into their faces, frozen and soot-streaked from the rigors of combat. The forest, scarred and silent, held testimony to the improbable defense that had unfolded. McKinley allowed himself a brief glance at the horizon, noting the ridge where the next wave might emerge. But there was no time for reflection. In war, moments of pause were dangerous. Survival demanded continuous vigilance.
The evening descended slowly, casting long shadows across churned snow and splintered trees. The squad moved cautiously, checking positions and tallying remaining ammunition. McKinley, despite exhaustion, remained alert, scanning for the first signs of movement that could indicate renewed German attacks. The fog rolled through the forest again, thin yet insidious, creating pockets of near-complete obscurity. Each sound, a snap of a branch, a distant footfall, a whispered command, was amplified, informing decisions that could mean life or death. The M1919, modified and unforgiving, remained the focal point of the defense. Its external magazine ensured continuous fire, disrupting any expectations of a reload pause. By this point, McKinley's rhythm of operation had become instinctual. Assess, aim, fire, reload, repeat. He moved like a machine, every gesture precise and deliberate. Around him, his men mirrored the same discipline, coordinated without words. The Germans attempted minor probes through the forest, yet each was met with a combination of calculated fire from McKinley and supporting riflemen. Shadows collapsed under gunfire, and retreating figures were chased by rapid, precise bursts from the M1919. Every advance was costly for the enemy, the forest littered with bodies of those who misjudged the timing. McKinley's focus was total, the forest itself receding from his attention except for threats that directly affected the line. He calculated trajectories, distances, and reload timing with an almost supernatural clarity, a direct consequence of his mechanical understanding and battlefield experience. The German infantry, attempting to learn from prior mistakes, began to alter timing, using irregular intervals to advance. McKinley's mind adjusted instantly. Bursts were now variable, rhythmic yet unpredictable, matching the modified capability of the weapon to maximize defensive efficacy. The fog, smoke, and drifting snow created a chaotic ballet of light and shadow as rounds tore through trees and snow, punctuated by the metallic echo of spent casings striking frozen ground. The forest bore the marks of relentless calculation and sustained violence. By nightfall, the Germans had again withdrawn, leaving behind a scene of frozen carnage. McKinley's squad survived with minimal losses, a testament to the tactical advantage provided by the M1919 modification. Exhaustion hung over the men like a physical weight, yet the lesson was clear. Firepower, precision, and unpredictability could offset overwhelming numbers. The forest was quiet, but the night carried a latent threat.
German commanders would not abandon attempts to break the line. The following day would demand the same unwavering discipline. Morning arrived pale and cold, illuminating the forest's scarred landscape. The snow glinted against broken branches, and frost-coated remnants of the previous day's firefights glimmered in muted light. McKinley and his men remained vigilant, knowing that enemy reconnaissance was likely assessing weaknesses in their position. Reports from scouts indicated German forces were regrouping, possibly preparing for a larger assault. The modified M1919 remained the linchpin of defense, its external magazine loaded and ready. The squad took positions along the defensive perimeter, the tension palpable despite moments of quiet. Each soldier moved with a precision born of repeated exposure to life and death scenarios where errors could be fatal. When the first distant sounds of enemy movement reached their ears, a faint crunch, the rustle of gear, muffled commands, McKinley's squad was ready. Fire broke out, methodical and disciplined, cutting through the foggy dawn. German formations faltered under sustained fire from both the M1919 and supporting riflemen. Attempts at coordinated flanking were thwarted as McKinley adjusted the weapon's angle and burst timing to match the irregularity of enemy movements. The forest erupted in chaos, flashes of light, echoes of gunfire, and the scent of gunpowder mingled with freezing air. Soldiers moved methodically, coordinating reloads, scanning approach paths, and maintaining positions with unspoken understanding. Each engagement further reinforced the psychological advantage of unpredictable continuous fire. The Germans hesitated where they would normally advance, counting rounds that never arrived in the expected pattern. By mid-morning, enemy momentum had collapsed. Casualty counts for the Germans were heavy, their morale shaken, while the American line remained intact, though worn and exhausted. McKinley allowed himself a brief glance at the external magazine, ensuring it remained fully seated and functional. Each round fired had been deliberate, each burst a combination of timing, calculation, and mechanical mastery. The squad survived another day, demonstrating the profound tactical advantage conferred by innovation, intuition, and unyielding discipline. The forest, scarred and quiet once again, bore witness to the improbable defense. By late afternoon, the forest settled into a fragile calm. The Germans had withdrawn entirely from the immediate area, retreating to regroup and rethink their strategy in the face of unexpected resistance. McKinley's squad, though battered and exhausted, remained alert, anticipating potential counterattacks, but knowing they had achieved a significant victory. The modified M1919 had killed 95 confirmed German soldiers in 48 hours, disrupted enemy tactics, and preserved the lives of dozens of American soldiers. McKinley lowered the weapon only briefly, assessing the landscape. Snow-covered trees stood like sentinels, branches scarred by bullets, shell fragments embedded in the frozen earth. Casualties lay frozen, unclaimed, their presence a stark reminder of the battle's cost. Officers and intelligence personnel arrived later, surveying the area with cameras and clipboards. Battalion reports confirmed the extraordinary achievement of the small squad. One squad, 7 men, had held against an entire company of SS Panzergrenadiers. The external magazine assembly was examined, photographed, and catalogued. Though McKinley received no medal, no commendation, the modification would eventually spread, copied informally by other riflemen who had observed the difference in firepower and survival rates. Yet for McKinley, recognition was irrelevant. The point had always been the lives saved, the men who survived because a 22-year-old friend did not have to die again. Years later, historians would trace casualty statistics, piecing together the story of innovation, courage, and mechanical ingenuity that had altered the course of local engagements during the Battle of the Bulge. McKinley returned to civilian life, carrying the knowledge of what had been achieved, but sharing little of the method. The forest healed, the snow melted, and time marched on, but the impact of those 48 hours endured. The modified M1919, once a forbidden creation born of necessity and ingenuity, became a silent testament to what can happen when individual initiative meets relentless circumstance. Lives were preserved, tactics evolved, and the thin line of defense held against impossible odds. The story ended not with accolades or fanfare, but with survival, legacy, and the quiet knowledge that courage, innovation, and unwavering resolve can shape history in ways unseen and unrecorded. McKinley, like the rifle, became a shadow in the annals of war, present, decisive, and quietly transformative.